I ended last Friday's session with a comment that I probably wanted to talk some more about adoptions that pose as marriages. It's a funny concept. I think I may be the one who coined the term. I don't know anybody else who's ever talked about this, but I've stumbled across it in my personal life and in my practice on various occasions, and it always fascinates me. Uh, so let me back into it by way of Grandmother's Barn. There was a book that was very popular, I think, not only for the mental health profession, but for the lay public back in the 1960s. It was called Transactional Analysis by Eric Byrne, and he wrote a companion volume called The Games People Play. Uh, Without using any professional jargon at all, he tried to describe relationship nodes of relationship disturbance of one sort or another using concepts that he developed. And he left us with the following that is relevant to my conversation for today. He said that in any enduring relationship, be it a supervisor supervisee relationship, a parent child relationship, a relationship between friends, if the two parties are adults, they cycle between three positions. Sometimes they're very childlike and they're feeling diminished, they're under stress, they've had too much, they're lost, and they're like aimless, troubled children. Other times, the very same person can be quite competent and they can be good companions, good friends, good partners, full of energy and full of competency. And at other times, they can rise up and they can be parental. They can be nurturing. They can be wise. They can be farther down the road than the person they're interacting with and therefore caretaking towards them. And that once we reach reasonably into adulthood, we're endowed with these potential three different roles that we can play in an interaction with a peer. And successful marriages are based upon being able to move freely between the three roles. Sometimes one member of the pair in the marriage is being done in or is confused, frustrated, overwhelmed, and needs a lot of caretaking. And the partner has to become a kind, respectful, supportive, and understanding parent. Sometimes that gets reversed. The very person who was being the kind parent at time A now is in great trouble at time B and needs the one who had been the child before to step into the parental role. Most of the time, the couple probably spends time as peers, as friend to friend, and in a mutual relationship where there's no big status difference and no differentiation of the what the interactions consist of. He also goes on to say if a relationship is to endure over a period of time, people have to be able to move flexibly between the three possibilities that they're going to be confronted with as need and as the behavior of the partner requires the shift. Those who, however, get stuck in one of those roles rigidly, it is part of their overarching adaptation as a human being or something they have trouble moving beyond when they're called upon doing it. Those who get stuck into interaction patterns that are based on a transaction that's fully into that set of roles and cannot flexibly move out of it for various periods of time, they can get quite troublesome, and after a while, it's hard for them to endure. So I'm particularly fascinated with the couples I have known and a friend I'm going to talk about who really was stuck. One member of the party is always in a parental role, and the other member of the party is always needing some kind of parenting from the one who's stuck in the parenting role. Uh, and it's mutually lived out by the two of them. Usually, one of them with more satisfaction than the other. So I will now tell the story of my friend Bob, who I first met in high school. Let me wait until the things. My wife got the phone, so it stopped ringing. Bob was not one of my best friends. He was a friend. I when I was in high school, social clubs were all the rage. They were like at the high school level fraternities and sororities. The people in the club hung out with each other at lunchtime. They did things socially together. They had parties together. They each one of them when they were recognized by the administration of the high school. Each one of them would schedule a dance, sometimes in the springtime too, and it would be hosted by a particular club. And I hated the whole system, just as I hated the fraternity sorority system when I got to college. I found this behavior egregiously egocentric, petty. Each one of the clubs thought it was the greatest in the world, and the others were beneath contempt, and they struggled for social position. Uh, so I found myself in high school with the oddballs and the misfits. We didn't want to be any part of that scene. Attended also the members of the clubs tended to come from the wealthiest families in the school. They competed with each other for what clothing they had, what cars they drove, and the lavishness of the richness of the hotels they could afford to rent to put on their dances, and the expensiveness of the particular bands they would hire to showcase their riches and their largesse. We didn't want any part of it. So we developed an anti-club that we all joined. And we would show up at their events and we would sneer and mock them and tell them we were going to blow them out of the water this year with what we were putting together for our event. We had no idea how we were going about doing that. Fortunately, Bob, who I'm now telling you about, his father was an accountant, and one of his accounting clients was back then a very well known star in the new days of television. And we wondered, could Bob get that guy to come and be the MC for our spring dance? That would really blow everybody out of the water. If we had him there, it was our club who had managed to bring him when nobody else had anything like a celebrity like this ever. So, wonder of wonders, he had enough vinegar in him about the misery of his own high school lives that he was willing to come and do this for us. He wasn't going to charge us. He was going to come and be ridiculous and mock people in high school and what the culture of high school was like. And it sounded absolutely wonderful. So I was eternally indebted to Bob for having pulled that one off successfully. That was the highlight of the spring season, that event. At any rate, we all went on to college and left that madness behind us. We got busy in different things. I was a psychology major. Bob wanted to get into the entertainment industry. He thought he was living in Los Angeles. That's where the entertainment industry was. He was going to be a film major. So he was over in the film school. I barely crossed paths with him on the campus. And I didn't see him very often. And our friendship networks expanded in other directions. I only saw him once in a while. The one thing we had in common relationship with, the Korean War was on, and we were all trying to figure out how we could avoid the draft and avoid being sent to Korea and killed. And I unfortunately, my best high school friends were idiots. They joined the Marine Reserves while they were still in high school, because if you were in the reserve, you couldn't be drafted. They were already on the ledger for the federal government. And they thought they would just have to go to reserve meetings once a month and for 2 weeks in the summertime, and they could ride out the war in the Marine Reserves. Well, horse shit. The second year of the war, their unit was activated, and they were sent to the front lines in Korea. One of them was wounded. Another one had bad frostbite from the winter campaign. I was so glad. They kept telling me I was a fool for not signing up, but I didn't. I took advanced Air Force ROTC. As long as I was in ROTC every year of college, I was not going to be drafted while I was in college. And when I finished college, I was going to be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force. And the program was to train supply officers. It felt very safe to me to be a supply officer in the Air Force because I was going to be requisitioning materials, staffing materials, distributing materials. I would not be flying combat or anywhere near any possibility of getting shot up or killed unless I was at some advanced air base somewhere close to combat. And in that war, we were flying off carrier decks, and there weren't a lot of Air Force people stationed in Korea. And I avoided the draft. He did the same thing. He went into Air Force ROTC, so I used to see him for training and marching several times a week. He got commissioned too, but he had the benefit of me. He had fallen in love just as I had. I got married the last year of college. He got married the last year of college. But through some kind of stroke of fate or contacts he had made in the film school, the girl he was in love with, madly in love with, was the daughter of a very well known Hollywood movie star. And he was going to become and did become the son in law of a very, very famous star. Not only that, the star had political chops. So when Bob got a second lieutenant's commission, Air Force headquarters assigned him to a unit that was making training films. So not only could he massage his filmmaking chops as a director, he was certainly safe. He was making training films for training various kinds of specialties in the Air Force. He was quite safe during the World War II. Life went on, the war ended. He came back from his gigs. He was mainly in Europe, having a wonderful time in Paris making films. I got to stay and having to report for active duty because the Air Force was in short supply of psychologists. They declared psychology a civilian occupation that they need more people from in the Air Force. So anybody who could get accepted in graduate school in psychology could stall their call to active duty until after they finished their graduate education, and then they would serve their 3 years after that. And that's what I managed to do. I never served a day on active duty, and before I graduated and got my doctorate, the war was over. The Air Force was discharging people. They didn't have the same personnel needs anymore, and I was put on the inactive reserve and thanked for my years of service during the Korean War. I still have all the paperwork in a bread box put away somewhere. Wonderful set of souvenirs. So I came back to Southern California and I got in touch with Bob again to see what had happened to him over the intervening years. I had lost touch with him. And I was curious to find my old friends, people I had known before I'd gone off to graduate school. He was one of them on my list. Well, it turned out he had gone through hell. He had returned from his tour overseas, looking forward to resume his marriage. And he came back to a young woman that he had left 3 years earlier for to serve his 3 years of active duty. And she was a chronic drunk now. She couldn't stay away from booze. And more than that, he heard from mutual friends that he had known over the years that she had been unfaithful to him steadily and consistently all the years he was gone. And it just tore his guts out. He was so miserable. He felt betrayed. He felt tormented because he had looked forward to returning from active duty, and he was sure his father-in-law was going to grease the skids and he would have gigs. He would be hired as producers or directors for various kinds of enterprises in the entertainment industry, and he just couldn't go on with the marriage. The pain of knowing her, even looking at her, was too great, and he filed for divorce, knowing full well his father-in-law was probably going to go into orbit, no matter how troubled she was or problematic she was going to go into orbit around his daughter, and he was going to lose his connection with his father-in-law, and that certainly had happened. Well, Bob had made some friends, and when he was going to film school, and he managed to be a creative entrepreneur. His father had become a more successful accountant, had some seed money for him, and he decided he was going to open his own little production house. He was going to make commercials. Wasn't going to make feature films because he didn't have the wherewithal for that degree of ambitiousness. But it wasn't going to take him that much to open a production house to make commercials. And he would not only be the CEO and the person who tried to make the connections. But when there was a, a commercial to be made, he would be the director too. He wouldn't have to pay for a director; he would direct. And his career was starting to take off. Soon after he got back, he became more and more successful and was making a good living. And I would see him every once in a while. And then he became somebody who was telling me an interesting story of his life. I'll fast forward. We're now in our early 30s. Bob had sworn to himself in the breakup of his marriage that marriage was a poisonous and dangerous institution. He was never going to get married again. He was going to have certainly date and carouse around and get sex when he felt like getting sex, but he preferred, by this time he bought himself a nice house. He preferred his dogs in the privacy of his nice house and not being vulnerable to anybody else. So he and I would go out for a dinner occasionally or out for lunch occasionally. And he would fill me in on his latest escapades in the singles world or how his net worth was growing and how he was having to hire more personnel at his commercial production house and new contracts he was getting from various kinds of continuing sponsors who wanted commercials and wanted his house to be the one who made their commercials and how he'd gotten in with agencies who booked these jobs. And he was doing very, very well. And he felt very content with himself. But then something happened. A mutual friend we knew, who we thought was never going to get married, was actually getting married now in his early 30s and had invited all of us to attend the wedding. I was a married man, so I got seated at a table with the other married couples. Bob was single, so he got seated at a table with single people. And there was a young woman at his table who obviously appeared to Bob to be very, very adorable and appeared to be very, very bright. And within the first few minutes, it was apparent that she was very smitten with him. She started flirting with him, saying words of appreciation, telling him she wanted to get to know him better. And she had been looking for him for years, and finally he had shown up. And by the end of the evening, she shook her finger at him and say, "Here's my phone number. Now I want you to call me because we're going to have our next date, first date next week. You're going to call me for the date, and I'm promising you, you're going to have such a wonderful time that you and I are going to get married. There's no way I'm going to let you escape me." She declared her intention to marry him, whether he was interested or wanted to or not. And he was complaining to me afterwards as we were waiting in line to get our cars from the car valet. He was saying that her behavior was outrageous, but he was obviously fascinated. And what do you mean she's going to marry me? And then his defiance came up. I'll show her. I'm going to take her out and fuck her brains out. There's no way I'm going to see her for a second visit. She's not going to marry me. Tell her. I'll put her back in her place. So I was laughing to myself secretly as we separated. Well, I'll cut to the chase. He started to see her regularly. She was like Scheherazade. She always had something new to tell him about, or some new way to make love to him, or some new interesting thing she was wrapping her head around. And he was really appalled because it turned out she was 19. She was still an undergraduate in college. And here he was with a 19-year-old, fascinated with her. And she was still living at home. And he met her parents. He said, "Well, I'm spending a lot of time with your daughter." They said, "Well, she said nice things about you. We don't mind. We trust her. She'll find her way in the world. When she's ready to move out, she'll tell us it's time to move out, and she can stay here as long as we want. We're not going to pick who she should make love to, who she should date. We're glad to meet you. You're an interesting person. You're welcome here anytime you come, want to come. So he was constantly being thrown off kilter by the experience he was having. And after about 6 months of knowing him, she said, "I think it's time I move out of my parents' house. I don't need to live there anymore. I'm coming to live with you," she said. She said, "You have a nice here. I'm comfortable. I stay overnight frequently. I'm just going to move in here." And he couldn't come up with any good reason to talk her out of it. So she moved in, and she graduated from college that time. Soon after she moved in with him, she graduated early. She was real smart, and she said, "You know what? I need something to do with my life. I'm out of college now. I've always had a kind of flair for design. I think I'm going to take some interior design courses at UCLA. Then I'm going to see if I can get a business going doing interior design." While she was working on her curriculum, she was visiting him at his office one day, and she said, "This place is a shithole. How can you live in this? There are all kinds of things you can do with this space to make it more interesting. I think I've learned enough already. I would like you to give me a budget of $50,000, and I'm going to do a makeover on your office space here. I'm going to get you new furniture and some decent artwork. I'm going to paint it different colors. Flooring looks like crap in here. I'm going to make this a place that's a show place that people like to come and visit you in, and your staff looks forward to coming to work in this place." So he did. He said, "What the hell? Well, let's see what she can do." And she did exactly what she proposed to do. And everybody was complimenting him on how beautiful his office space was, and who was the decorator. And he said, "My wife." And she started to get work from clients of his who wanted their home interiors making. And she started making a six-figure income within a year of getting into this gig. And he was odd with her. And she said, "Well, there's a second project I need to take on. You have a very nice home that we're living in here, but it needs major work." She said, "I want $200,000 to redo this house, and I'll make this house a show place that you'll be proud to live in." And she did that for the house too. Then she got bored. She said, "It's time to get married now. Life is getting stale. I don't think I'm ready even to take this on, but maybe one day I want to have children. So it's time for you and I to get married." And he couldn't think of any good reason for not marrying her. So they got married. Soon after they were married, she said, "I've sold my business. I'm going to be a consultant to my business, but somebody else is going to run it. And I've discovered I'm getting into my early 30s now. I've discovered what I really want to do with my life. It's not design at all." She said, "I was an anthropology major when I was an undergraduate. I think what I'd really like to do, I'd like to get a doctorate in anthropology." She said, "I want to go back to school." He said, "Well, how long is that going to take?" She said, "Probably 4 or 5 years." And he said, "And you'll have enough time to consult with the business you're leaving on?" "Yeah." She said, "There's going to be one problem, though." He said, "What's the problem?" She said, "Well, I'm going to have to do some field work. And eventually I'm going to have to, I want to, the branch of anthropology I'm going in is archaeology. I'm going to become an archaeologist. I'm going to have to go somewhere in the world. I don't even know where. It depends on where my on something. I'm going to have to excavate an older civilization and find the artifacts and write a doctoral dissertation on the people who occupied that time and place. That's the kind of doctoral dissertations that are written in the sub branch of archaeology that I get into. So I'll have to learn how to do that. And probably every summer while I'm going through school and taking my own classes, I'll probably have to go on some professor's dig somewhere in the world and put in 5 or 6 weeks of volunteer time learning what that dig is all about, and what are the tools you need, and what are the precautions you have to take, and how do you treat specimens well and take good care of them. What are the local regulations in various countries about taking artifacts out of the country, and on and on. All kind of learning, practical learning I have to do, and there's no way to do it without being gone. So I'm going to be gone for big chunks of time. And he said, just you and the professor? She said, no, there'll be other people on the dig too. Some of them are going to be men. Yeah, some of them are going to be men. He said, so you're going to go away where there's other men, leave me for 6 weeks every summer. And his old wounds started to flare up. She's not going to be faithful to him. How could she restrain herself? She's a very sensual woman. She's going to be in some strange part of the world with people she doesn't know. People will be very intimate with each other because they're working side by side every day. Somebody's going to be flirting with her, and at night when everybody's gone to bed, she's going to start fucking somebody. He had the daydream down pat of how she was going to betray him, and he said, "No, you don't have my permission to go take a PhD in archaeology." He said, "You're going to go study literature or something like that, where you don't have to go anywhere, where you'll come home every night. I don't want you to be gone from me for 6 weeks every summer. That's a deal breaker." Uh, and she said, "I'm a grown woman. You can't boss me around." "Well, if you want to stay living here with me, you're going to have to do what I'm telling you." He started to pull rank and age and position in the world. I make your life possible, and you're going to, if you want this marriage to continue. And he reminded her of what his first wife had done to him. She knew the story. He said, I'll admit I am not good at this. I don't want to take a chance on you. My trust level is not great with almost everybody, and even though you've done nothing maybe to deserve this, I cannot take this chance. I would be devastated if you did that to me, and I don't know if you can resist the temptation. You've never been put to the test, as far as I know. So they went back and forth and back and forth. And in desperation, since I was a psychologist, while they were thrashing out this unresolved dilemma between the two of them, she was crying and hurt and angry and said, "Well, fuck you, I'm going to leave." And he would then cry and say, "Don't leave. We'll find some way through this somehow." He called me and said, what should you do? What should I do? I said, well, there are three choices. You can hold her position and maybe she'll crumble and stay with you and do something else, but she'll sell out to that, and she will be very hurt, and she will have a great deal of bitterness to her inside of her that you forbade her from doing something that was very heartfelt and something she looked forward to do and be invested in for the rest of her life. In order to hold on to you, she had to make the sacrifice of taking that away. And I said, or you can let her go. You can hold her with a light touch and tell her you're terrified, but you'll trust her not to betray you, and you're a wealthy man now, you can try and visit her for chunks of time during that 6 weeks. You can go and volunteer some time on the dig. You can put your jobs on hold for little periods of time. You can bring her home for long weekends and see if that's possible. And you don't have to be totally without her for the whole 6 weeks that she's gone, and you could drop in on her occasionally, so that in itself will help restrain her from wandering off the straight and narrow when she's with you. And he said, I don't know if I can stand the tension when she's not here in my bed at night. I said, well, maybe you could learn to stand the tension. And wonder of wonders, he let her go. She went through graduate school, she got her degree, and she came home. She was now about 35 when she was all finished. She had gone to a dig in Mexico, in the Mexican mountains, for her own project. I forgot what her project was all about. And he was very proud of her, actually. And she said, all right, I need to use my education. I now need to be a faculty member somewhere. And he said, well, you're fortunate. There are a lot of good universities here in Southern California. Maybe you can get a gig at one of the universities. And she said, well, I've looked. Nobody has any vacancies. There's not a large demand for teachers of anthropology specializing in archaeology. There tend to be one or two people. Even in large universities, there may not be one or two persons fulfilling that role. I have to go somewhere where there's a vacancy. She said, I've been trying to be attentive and responsive to you. Here's what I'd like you to do. If I can get a job somewhere else, say if there's a faculty position at NYU, for instance, you have already amassed a large sum of money. I would like you to sell your business, and I'd like you to come away with me and be my husband, thinking of what his new career might be. or looking for things you can do in the entertainment industry in some other city, if we're in some other city, I would like you to now hitch your wagon to my cart and come away with me. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. This is too much in my blood. It's too important to me. Oh, goodness. Let me stop the phone from ringing. Okay. I don't know if you heard that or not because I'm using headphones. Uh, and again, they were bickering and going back and forth. He said, would you settle for seeing if you could get an adjunct position, get some part-time teaching at one of the local universities? Would that tide you over until there was a full-time opening at one of the local universities? They finally compromised on that. And she did get, she was, where was she teaching? I think she was teaching at USC. She was teaching a single elective course on something that had been her field of study when she had been a graduate student and doing her dissertation. And that nourished her some. And she wrote some scholarly papers. And she was stay at home and confronted him with the next challenge. She had discretionary time. It was time to become a parent. She wanted to get pregnant. And he said, oh, we have such a special relationship. We've been through so much, so many challenges. Things are just now getting to where they should be. My business is humming. You're happy in your career. It's not everything you want, but you will get an adjunct, a full-time position somewhere down the road. Somebody will retire and you'll get a slot. And then everything will be perfect. Why are we going to screw it up and have to disrupt everything in order to have a child? And once more, she had to plead with him and talk to him. And much to his surprise, they had children, one little girl and then another little girl. And by the time he was in his early 40s, she was a full-time professor at USC and was raising two children, and life seemed utterly idyllic. And I was thinking of what had happened to her. She had never left home and gone completely out into the world and taken up the responsibility for her life. Somehow she needed to stay in her parents' house and never leave until she got him to adopt her. He was indeed a surrogate parent who watched over her, put his needs to one side, and kept supporting her. She tried on various occupational choices. She was struggling with her occupational identity, and then her entire lifestyle, and then finally what was to be her final identity that she would embrace fully, and then moving over into embracing the parental role too. He was on duty, watching over her, supporting her, a lot of times making it all possible, being kind, understanding, only getting angry and upset and trying to script her for episodes of that over time. And there he was raising her. And I was predicting to myself, since I had become wise about lifespan development, somewhere where the children were getting older and they didn't need much attention for her, his reward would be that she would now say, I'm divorcing you. I've never had enough life experience with other men. You've been really the only man in my life. The children are older. They can do without me. I need to try on other ways of living. I don't want to be attached to you anymore. That would be his wonderful reward for having stood into all of that. Uh-uh, that isn't what happened. One day I thought, well, I haven't heard from him and his family. I hadn't heard from him for almost a year. I've been busy with other things. I think I'll call him up. So I called him at work. And I said, Bob, how are you? He said, terrible. I said, what's wrong? He said, I'm going through an awful divorce. I said, oh, I'm really sorry. I wondered if there was the seeds of instability in your relationship all this time. I really expected that Jan one day might decide she had never been on her own, that she might simply want to be without a mate, without a partner that she had to report into or deal with, because she had never done it when she was younger. He said, oh, no, no, Jan didn't leave. I did. I said, you left? He said, yeah, I hired an assistant director. And She was 29 and she was gorgeous. And boy, was she smart and capable. And I tried to resist the temptation, but I couldn't resist. And I am so infatuated with her. I risked everything. I went home and I apologized and I left. And she and I are living together now. Oh, so what is life all about? I think over and over again, at least all the years I can think of, I've had at least one marriage that's been an adoption that's been posing as a marriage. There's been a significant age difference between the couple. One of them has never left home successfully. They've either been at home and gone straight into the marriage with the new partner, or they've gone into an early marriage with somebody else, and now they're having a love affair with the somebody else because they need to get out of that home. That home's become poisonous, but it's too scary for them and overwhelming to take life fully into their own hands. So now they're going to have an affair and hope that the affair partner now becomes the person that adopts them and provides for them and helps them to make the transition into a better life. And each time they're probably doing a good thing. They're picking somebody who's a better parent than the previous one was. But again, I think when they get fully nourished, they're going to leave home finally and want to be on their own for at least a period of time. All right, I think I will stop with that topic for now. You guys can keep track of any questions or comments you want to make about adoptions posing as marriages. And now I'm going to go back to something else and go back to screen sharing. Ah, ha, ha. My good old individual life cycle stages should be here. And well, nobody's yelling and protesting, so I assume it is in front of you now, as it should be. And we have now completely finished talking about intimacy versus isolation because having an adoption that poses as a marriage is a way of temporarily settling this issue, but it's a fragile way and it breaks apart eventually. And the one who's done goes out into isolation for a while, and they seem to be bent towards wanting a partner, and typically they will find a partner later, or they decide to embrace a greater degree of isolation and never have to be accountable to anybody else ever again. But I want to keep going up the scale of the older life cycle stages. Stage one prime typically plays out during the years between leaving home, typically in the late teens, early 20s, on into the middle or later 30s. That's when the final solutions to the problems embedded in intimacy versus isolation get resolved for better or for worse. Soon thereafter, the next stage, 2 prime, role flexibility versus role rigidity becomes the issue that must be dealt with. Uh, how can I get into this? Well, this way. First, I'll tell you some normative ages. This typically shows up somewhere between 35 and 45 and has to play out. And the typical trigger is that uh, people are making the decision to have a child and to raise a child. Role flexibility versus role rigidity is one of the two stages my work group in graduate school under my leadership developed as we looked at Ericksonian theory. We added these to the eight he had come up with. We and the first three, just as the first three of the stages down below, come on fairly quickly. By the time young people are out of stage three, they've only lived about the first 7 years of their life, a very small portion of their life. Industry versus inferiority plays out over 6 years by itself. The 6 years of elementary school typically, And identity versus role confusion plays out over all the teenage years. So the later stages are more complex and take longer to navigate through. The same thing with the adult stages. The first three come on while one is still fairly young, and the last two play out in later life. So the second of the early stages in adulthood is role flexibility versus role rigidity. There is a phenomenon I've encountered over and over again. And they're young people from my perspective because I'm very elderly. Young people in their early, middle 30s on towards 40s. And in that era, they're showing up. They have some fairly specific concerns that are troubling them. But by and large, they feel like they understand their life and they may be doing parts of her life clunky, but on the whole, they feel like they're ready for the adult world and they're managing it reasonably well. They don't feel like they're in terrible, serious trouble anywhere, but they do want the therapist consultation about some nodes of distress they're going through. People who come in before this age are terribly floundering. They they will acknowledge they don't know how to put their life together properly. There's some chunks of it that just aren't working right. They don't know what's wrong and how to make the whole matrix function at least in a reasonably tolerable way. So during this era, people have arrived at the top of the range. They feel like they're in a meadow, even though they might look at another mountain range that they have to traverse later on. But something has happened to break this apart. It can be the loss of a career. Maybe they've been fired from a job they've been in, and suddenly they're without the income they're used to, and they're scrambling around trying to find work. The birth of a baby, I'm telling you, will sabotage this because the family is full of rituals about how things get done, how decisions are made, who does what kind of supportive work, who gets to make which kinds of choices, how to manage conflict, that whole list of things that have to be learned to have a good partnership with somebody has been reasonably well mastered. They have a joint budget, they're managing their finances, on and on and on. The birth of the baby destroys the structure. Everything comes collapsing down. It's like a major remodel has to be done to the house. So I'll use a different metaphor. And the sledgehammers are hard at work cracking and breaking everything apart. So the people who get through this are those who have learned and are learning how to be role flexible. For instance, maybe it's better. This is an extreme example. I'm having trouble finding work. The pandemic is on. Maybe you could go back to work. There's much more opportunity for you in this shut down economy. Let me stay home and be a house husband. Let's swap positions. Give the baby to me more, and I'll take care of the baby. I don't have to be macho guy who thinks that raising children is women's work. There's an ability to move flexibly between the assignments each has taken and let the other take those over without a lot of sexual stereotyping about this is beneath me or this isn't right or I feel castrated if I do this or no woman that's too butch for me, I can't do that. Only men do that kind of thing. I'm going to feel terribly uncomfortable. It's not for me. They're into rigid definitions of who they are and what they are to be doing, and they find it hard to shift gears. They're locked in role rigidity. That's stage one. It's two prime, but it's stage one of the two that we've added to the Ericksonian model, and it sits, no surprise, on top of stage two, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Remember, during this era, there's a tremendous amount of socialization going, table manners, toilet training, sharing, politeness, use of utensils, learning to recognize letters for the beginning, learning not to throw temper tantrums. And if the socialization has gone on with reasonable support, kindness, and appreciation of mastery rather than scolding for failure, there's a sense of autonomy in the child that endures. I can do new challenges. So this carries forward into the era above. I can embrace new challenges. I can be flexible. I can try on new things. I don't have to script myself rigidly. I don't have to please other people around me and public opinion who think it's stupid for me to be doing this, or this is a waste of my time or talent, or I could never succeed at doing this. I'll risk it and try anyhow. So those are the textures of role flexibility versus role rigidity. And the other one we added was social engagement versus social detachment. So I promise everyone there'll be a crisis. It may be a health crisis, birth of a child crisis, a career crisis, a collapse of a parent suddenly crisis. Some crisis will happen that'll break open the structures and demand role flexibility versus role rigidity in that decade between about 35 and 45. That will require trying on new things in a different way. And sorting things out if one has a partner and reassignment of things to the partner the one has ordinarily been the one doing. The next challenge comes up because people learn to be flexible and life is harmonious and humming reasonably well again. There is a foreshadowing restlessness that takes place around age 45. It isn't formulated very well until the next decade. But the shadow of impending death is beginning to play across the life of the individual. And interestingly enough, Adler is the only one who talks about this. He talks about social justice and social meaning. He believes that we have a need as a species to give back to the groups that we belong to be altruistic and to give back to the culture. And uh, because the shadow of death is beginning to lean over us, the desire to do so now becomes tinged with a greater urgency. It's not something that we can await forever to embrace later in life because it has visions of being a kind of immortality project. So it can be quite simple. If you're a machinist in a machine shop and you're running a lathe, and somebody younger than you comes to take up the lathe, and you see them bumbling around, when you're younger, you don't give a fuck. You're not going to get involved. It's not interesting to you. But when you're older, when you're in the era I'm talking about, you want a mentor. It suddenly occurs to you, let me show the poor bastard how to do that and do it quicker and with a different piece of the machinery than a different jig than he's using on his lathe right now. He would have a better outcome if I showed him how to do that. For those who are childless, they may think they want to become a big brother or big sister. They start donating time to these things. Even silly women who are the arm candy of very wealthy men decide they want to do something philanthropic. They want to become a docent at the museum, or they want to adopt a charity and start doing charitable work for something. They want to save whales. God knows what they want to do. But they want to engage with the greater good of the world around them. It may be for animals, it may be for fellow human beings. And even the most selfish and self centered ones, in a healthy adaptation to life, start embracing the pull of social engagement and don't go off into this pull of social detachment. Adler, I think, says correctly that those who fail to do that are not getting a kind of feedback from the world that is nourishing to them, and they go into a mild depression. So, this is one thing clinicians should be suspicious of. If somebody between 35 and 45 comes in and seems their life seems to be in order in all ways, but they have an unnameable mild depression, you need to check whether they need to do some social work contribution, some social service of some kind. Are they doing any at all? Are they making the world any better for anybody outside their own immediate family or even outside of themselves? And that's an important thing to check out. So, my time's almost up today. I will talk about the signs of trouble in these two eras during my next presentation. And I also want to talk about good enough parenting for adult children because the children are moving along their line of later and later development here. And the parents are not out of their life. When I first wrote about good enough parenting, it was only for the five stages below, where the parent is very actively involved in trying to be role models or consultants and guides about these dilemmas. But parents don't go away. And it occurred to me, they're still a very active force unless there's been a cutoff of the relationship with parents all across this span of the five later life changes, unless the parents have died along the way. So there is good enough parenting of adult children too, which I'll talk about next time. And on that note, I will stop screen sharing. Oh, that was screen sharing. Stop screen sharing and come back to regular business here. Okay, I'm at your pleasure. I hope you like my story and my friend Bob.
Arthur, I have a question or a comment about Bob, and I think about him being involved in movies in Hollywood, and him being potentially infatuated with younger women.
Yes.
And is that a Hollywood phenomenon where you see, producers, directors, actors, men who are involved with women who are 20, 30, 40 years younger than them? And could that also be an element of kind of like what was plaguing Bob during
Yes,
all of
I'm
this?
sure. I can comment on Bob again when I talk about the later stages of the life cycle challenge. And I'm not using him as a reason that the adoption posing as a marriage failed, because she grew up and somehow she navigated the transition and became wife instead of child. She did become a good companion to him. It was something else that undid that relationship between them. It was his personal dynamics, not the dynamics of the marriage that was playing out. They somehow managed to be in that small group of couples who can go from an adoption posing as marriage as to being quite a rich and fulfilling marriage. And I expected, that's what startled me. I expected they would live that out for the rest of their lives. And all of a sudden, he's the one leaving when it's usually the kid who needs to grow up as the member of that partnership who leaves. So yes, Bob had his own reasons, and you're talking about that. Did you see the movie Moonstruck?
No, no, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a couple, the older couple. They have a spinster daughter, and they're the older couple. It's a loving Italian family, and she knows his secret. She knows he has a girlfriend, and she's too proud to tell him about it. And she's a traditional Italian woman. She's not going to blow up the marriage, but she keeps asking everybody he meets, "Why is he doing this?" And the same answer comes back over and over again. She interviews men primarily. Why is he doing that? And the answer the scriptwriters put in, he's afraid of dying. They tell
Yeah,
her.
yeah. Was Bob
So,
afraid of dying?
yeah, I think we're all afraid of dying.
Well,
I mean, there's
At a
worse ways
period of life. No,
to.
I'm no longer afraid of dying. I'm sad about dying. I'm not afraid of it anymore. But our first brushes with having to confront mortality, and I'll be talking about this, is terror. Oh my God, death is not just something on some distant horizon I can keep forgetting about. It's actually coming closer, and I am going to die, followed by a scream, a scream of terror. But that's a later lecture.
Yeah, that's a whole lecture in itself.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, or I guess it's just an observation and maybe something to look out for, but I think there can be marriages where there's an adoption, but the people's ages aren't that different. I think that sometimes you'll have two people together where
Yeah.
even though they're not very separated by age, there's still a developmental difference big enough
Yes,
to
that can
cause it.
happen.
Yeah.
Often you'll see people at various ages where one is just lagging a whole stage behind, and there's tension and incompatibility between the two of them because they're struggling with very different issues in very different ways, and it's if they're creatures of different cultures almost.
Mhm.
Somebody's in a growth spurt ahead into the next challenges, and they used to be well understood by their partner who was walking by their side, and suddenly they occupy land is talking about things that have no resonance for the partner.
Mhm.
What a strange existence has been created for us.
What was so enduring about your relationship with Bob? You kind of maintain that contact for all those years.
I don't know. I found him an interesting person.
Hmm.
I loved I loved people. Well, I'm guilty of this too. I loved how he knew exactly where he was headed for and what he was going to do. Uh, I remember, I tell this story often. I remember when I was in my middle 30s and fumbling around, and once again in that soup I talked about, role flexibility versus role rigidity. All I would do is shake my head and say, "There's only one eternal truth I have left. I'm never going to again say what I'm always going to do or what I'm never going to do." That's the only thing that was left, not to do that. And what I loved about him and knowing him was he always had one of those things going. Now he understood life, and now he was doing it properly, and he was content with whatever he had put together and whatever was happening because he could rest into the rest of his life.
Yeah, it's fun to meet people like that because secretly you hope they're right. You hope maybe someone actually figured it out.
So I had to check with him periodically and to see if his definition of what the purposes and structures of his life was to be had remained stagnant, and just as he hoped they would, or whether some new dilemma was now tormenting him.
Mhm.
He had it went back to his saying he knew his career path. He was set. His father-in-law to be was going to get him into the industry, and he was going to succeed as a very famous director. He knew he was talented. That was all worked out and certain, and that blew apart. Then the next thing that blew apart was he was never going to get married again. He was just going to be a philanderer. Earl Flynn was his cultural hero. He was going to have lots of heroes and be a swashbuckler and enjoy them and savor every one of them and never, never, never allow himself to be vulnerable to a woman again. He would announce that over and over again with great certainty. Well, he was certain he was going to take a chance. He was certain his second wife was going to betray him if she went off on the digs. He would startle over and over again that he would go to visit her. He went to visit her 4 times. Once each year for 3 or 4 days as part of her 6 weeks. And she would obviously welcome him ecstatically. She was so happy to see him and so reassuring. And he saw the other people who were around on the dig and he would shake his head and say, "Nah, there's nobody here. She's going to be tempted with." And he would get reassured again. But he would be in a panic again the following year, knowing this year was the year she was going to betray him. He was so certain.
Hmm.
God damn it. I can't, I get so, I want to laugh at people who see their imagery and see their dreams of what's happening in the world and their prediction for what's coming. And they absolutely believe with 100% certainty that because they can see it, it is going to happen.
Yeah.
That he was that kind of bright guy, but a fool, nevertheless, always fascinated me. Oh, that's really cruel of me. I think I lost interest in him when he became so trivially predictable because the rest of his life wasn't predictable to me at all. He became so trivially predictable that he was the rich guy in the entertainment industry that had to run off with the young arm candy who adored him. I'd seen that script too many times and I wasn't interested in another version of it.
Mhm.
Or maybe I was afraid I'd get tempted.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Anything else?
Yeah.
I guess we're done for today.
All right. Good seeing
Okay.
you guys.
All
See you
right.
next week.
Have a good
Bye
weekend.
Bye.